Hi guys, welcome back to the channel. So today I'm going to do a strategy breakdown. I've been asked many times in the comments what's the strategies I'm using, and I've been going over my trading plan, looking at some things I did in the past which I haven't done recently, and one of the ones that jumped out at me was pivot trades. So one of the reasons I've not been using these recently is predominantly because I've been working on MetaTrader 4, and in the past when I was working on other charting software, the indicators for pivot points were fantastic. It's literally worked perfectly every single time. And a lot of the ones on MT4 take a bit more customization to really get to make sure they're the most reliable ones out there. So what I'm going to do today is really give a overall introduction to what pivot trades are, how I originally first learnt them, and then I'm going to go on to probably tomorrow or the next few days do some live streams on setups and how we actually trade these. I'm going to trade them on one of my accounts for about a month. I'm going to review all of the setups and how it's all been performing and whether there's been any tweaks on that one, and come back in a month's time and review the progress and see if this is a definite strategy we can all be using on our daily routines. So before we get going, please hit the subscribe button. Close to 1,000 subscribers now. It'd be great to get over that in the next few days, and please give the video a big thumbs up. So what are pivot points? Essentially we have a pivot point line which is calculated from the previous day's range on the Forex, and then we have levels of support and resistance. For example, resistance 1, 2 and 3, support 1, 2 and 3, and again they're calculated from the previous day's movement and relationship to the pivot point. So the pivot point line is calculated from the high, the low and the close, taking those together and divided by 3. That's then plotted on the charts to give us literally where our entry point is going to be. And this is where we get a few discrepancies in calculating the pivot points, because it's not an exact science. Essentially we're taking the end of the day, but what is the end of the day since Forex is 24 hours? So what most people tend to do is take the end of the US session, so 5 o'clock in the US, 9 o'clock UK time, and then calculate the pivot point based on that, and then obviously then all the resistance support lines are based from that particular line. But typically what we can see on a lot of the candles, especially on a daily chart, is that although we have some after hours movement, especially in the last hour or so, we can see a few pips movement, and essentially a lot of the charts can even take the end of the day at midnight where it ticks over to the actual next calendar day, and therefore we could be into the start of the Asia session and again be a discrepancy of a few pips on the actual lines and support resistance themselves. So why do pivot points and these resistance lines work? Well, it's always down to their visual, and they're on a lot of people's charts. If we look at the moving averages, they're often seen as, again, levels of direction or support and resistance. Again, they're just based on price historically, and it's exactly the same thing with pivot points. And because people are using these on so many charts across the world, the price is drawn towards them. And statistically, if we look at how many times price will hit resistance 1 or support 1 in any particular day, that's almost a 80% chance of it hitting that level. Now we could argue that price would go there regardless of whether they were on the chart or not, purely based on the fact that, let's say a particular range on a currency pair is 100 pips, and we're saying that our support and resistance are only 40 pips away, for example, then typically that range, they're going to break through them regardless, unless we've got a very sideways day and it's doing nothing at all. There are so many different ways that people interpret how to trade this particular setup. Now, there's no right or wrong way, as with all particular trading strategies. Some people say you need to have a candlestick pattern or a chart pattern or some form of overbought and oversold to get into the trade itself. I like to simplify a little bit and just literally try and trade with the actual main direction of that particular pair and go in that one where it breaks through the pivot line and set a target of the resistance 1 if we're going long, or support 1 for shorts. Again, using some rudimentary places to find our stop losses, either at support 1, resistance 1, or below the pivot point, or a swing low of a particular day. And as with all trades, we want to be looking at targeting a reward to risk of 1 or greater. Now, because of how these particular points are calculated, they're not massively wide. We're not able to get a huge runner on these. We're looking for the most probability, the highest statistical probability of getting a successful trade, and that's why pivot points work very well. Often a lot of these moves happen in the pre-European sessions, so let's say 7 o'clock UK time, when the markets are opening up, the banks are opening up, and there's starting to become some volume on the particular currency pairs, especially euro, dollar, British pound, Swissy as an example. If we look at some of the Australasian pairs, so the Aussie or the Kiwi, now because a lot of their news articles come out in their session, if we're trading those particularly on pivot points, that move may already happened in the early hours of the morning and therefore not really viable for trading this particular strategy. But there's always particular pullbacks in the afternoon, and they can always use that pivot line as a level of bounce and still target that resistance 1 level if we're going long as an example. So I'm going to bounce over the charts right now, take a quick scan through some of the currency pairs, how the setup is done on MetaTrader, and then we'll go from there. Okay, so here in MetaTrader 5, and here's my indicator for the pivot points. As I said before, there are different ways of actually customizing this one. So it calculates the pivot mode on this particular one for the high, low and close. And you can change that to make sure that, for example, it is how most people do it. High, low and close divided by 4. There are other ways of doing it, and that's why the pivot point can be slightly off by a few pips. So here we have euro dollar. We've taken a look at the higher time frame to make sure we are definitely in an uptrend. So therefore here we're going to be looking for longs when price breaks through the pivot. Pivot here is the blue line. As we can see, again, price is above the moving averages, therefore looking for longs. And yes, it did break up earlier in the day. It pulled back down. It's gone nowhere near close to the support 1 or resistance 1. It's just in that range at the moment. So this typically I'll be looking to buy euro with a target of this particular line here, which is our R1, and putting the stop loss here just below the pivot line and the moving averages and trail it up to there. This pair, I've actually got an active trade running at the moment. This is the Swissy. As we can see, we've got the pivot line coming through. So the early morning session price did come down. It pulled back up to the pivot line, hovered around it for a couple of hours, broke back down. It didn't hit our resistance 1 or our support 1 lines. So here I put my target at just above the support 1, and my stop loss is just pretty much around the highs above the pivot line. So we've got a 1-to-1 on this one. I think we're looking to make 18 pips, risking 15. So again, not a massive trade, and we're getting close to taking our profit. So this chart is cable. Again, we can see it's in an uptrend, price above all the moving averages, therefore looking for longs. If we look at the lower time frames, we've seen at the end of yesterday's session, there was a big sell-off in the British pound, and therefore that's a bit of a retracement, and therefore the price is coming up. It hasn't really done much today. It's just basically bouncing around. It's one that I probably wouldn't have taken purely by the fact that when we look at where S1 and R1 is, we've got a big disparity here. There's a greater range between the pivot line and support 1 than there is up to resistance 1. So again, if I was using this as an example and putting my stop loss in below the lows of the day, I wouldn't be getting a 1-to-1 if I was to literally trade this and break above the pivot line. It's not a 1-to-1, so therefore I can discount this one for trading it today. This chart here is CAD. As you can see, again, nice downward trend looking for shorts. Again, if we look on the 15-minute chart, price was ranging today. It's broken down through the pivot line. It's not hit up to my resistance 1. It's obviously broken back down. It's broken down through the low of the day. That's when I took the short on this one. It's come all the way back down below the moving averages. I've got my stop loss just above the pivot point and my target in a few pips time. So again, hoping to take a profit on this one very soon. So this chart here is British pound yen. As we can see, upward trend, but a bit of price coming off that in the last couple of days and a few sessions. Again, if we look down to the 15-minute chart for where we're looking to trade the pivots, price has literally been bouncing around the pivot point all day. We'll be looking for longs here because we're in an uptrend, and nowhere on this chart is it showing me I'll be looking for a buy signal because price is always below the moving averages on this particular time frame. We can also use pivot points on other instruments. So here we've got the FTSE. Now, as we know, the FTSE's been in a pretty strong uptrend recently, but has been in a bit of a sell-off from the highs of just over 7,000 in the past week or so. So as we can see here, we are in that sort of indecision direction with a bit of a sideways motion on this 15-minute chart. And you see literally the price is being ranging between resistance 1 and support 1, just literally bouncing above and down the pivot line. So for me, this is not a tradable setup right now if we're doing purely just the pivot strategy. Hope you've enjoyed this quick strategy breakdown and something you can incorporate into your particular trading plans and your styles. As I said before, I'm going to do some live trading, some live streams on this, as well as trading it for over a month on one of my other accounts and really seeing how reliable and profitable it can be. And then tinkering and tailoring it to make sure we can get the most successful, best strategy possible. Cheers.